In a small American town, silence ruled. One moment changed everything. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if this story matters. Late fall settled over eastern New Mexico without ceremony. It arrived dry and quiet, carried on a wind that scraped dust across the highway and pressed itself into every crack of the land. The sky was a washed-out blue, stretched thin over miles of flat desert, broken only by low mesas and scattered scrub. Along Highway 64, traffic moved rarely and without urgency, as if even vehicles understood there was no reason to hurry through this part of the state. It was the kind of place people passed through and forgot, a place that did not announce itself or ask to be remembered. Red Willow sat just off the road, barely more than a widening of asphalt and a handful of buildings that had survived by refusing to change. A single gas station with faded prices painted directly onto the sign. A diner with cracked windows and a neon logo that flickered more than it glowed. A small sheriff's office squatting at the far end of town like an unblinking eye. That was nearly all of it. No hotels, no fast food chains, no reason to stop unless you needed fuel, coffee, or a moment to let the road release its grip on you. People who lived in Red Willow had learned to keep their lives narrow. They spoke softly in public, avoided lingering in doorways, and rarely looked at one another for too long. It wasn't written anywhere, but everyone knew the rules. Attention attracted questions, and questions had a way of turning into problems. The town functioned on routine and restraint, and those who survived longest were the ones who learned to stay within the invisible lines. A dusty pickup slowed as it approached the diner, tires crunching against gravel before coming to a stop. The engine idled for a moment, then shut off. The driver remained inside, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, posture relaxed, but alert. His name was Caleb Turner. He was 36 years old, tall, lean, and built with the kind of strength that didn't draw attention until it needed to. His hair was cut short in a simple utilitarian style that suggested habit rather than fashion. A short beard framed his jaw, neatly kept, and his face held the calm neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to advertise his thoughts. Caleb had no intention of staying in Red Willow longer than it took to eat. He was moving west, following no strict schedule, choosing roads that allowed him to stay anonymous. The desert suited him. It asked little and offered nothing it didn't intend to give. As he sat in the truck, his eyes moved briefly to the sheriff's cruiser parked near the office at the edge of town. It sat angled slightly toward the road, as if claiming ownership of everything that passed through. Caleb noted it without reaction. Observation was automatic, a habit that had never left him. At his side, a Belgian Malinois waited in complete silence. The dog, Rex, was 5 years old, compact and powerful, his fawn coat darkened along the back and face. He sat upright, posture disciplined, amber eyes focused forward. There was no nervous movement, no restless shifting. Rex was not a pet riding along for companionship. He was a working K9, trained for precision, obedience, and restraint. Between the man and the dog existed a quiet understanding, shaped by repetition and trust. Neither needed to look at the other to communicate readiness. They exited the truck together, moving in sync across the gravel lot toward the diner. The wind tugged at Caleb's jacket, carrying the faint smell of dust and gasoline. The bell above the diner door rang when they entered, thin and tired, barely cutting through the low murmur inside. Warm air wrapped around them, heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and old grease. The interior was narrow, worn down by years of use and neglect. Vinyl booths lined the walls, cracked and patched. The linoleum floor bore stains that never quite disappeared, no matter how often it was scrubbed. A handful of people occupied the space. 2 older men sat near the window, shoulders hunched, speaking in voices kept deliberately low. Near the counter, A woman scrolled on her phone without lifting her head. Conversation dipped slightly when Caleb entered, not from alarm, but from instinct. New faces were noticed here, measured quietly, then filed away. Caleb chose a corner booth with his back to the wall. Rex slipped beneath the table and lay down immediately, body flat, chin resting on the floor, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The dog's presence was controlled and deliberate, ready without being displayed. Caleb removed his jacket and set it beside him, movements unhurried, economical. He had learned long ago that blending in was often a matter of not giving people anything to react to. From behind the counter, a waitress approached with a coffee pot in hand. Emily Carter moved with practiced efficiency, tall and slender, her dark blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail that emphasized the tired lines around her eyes. She wore a simple apron over her uniform, clean but worn thin. There was a softness in her expression, but also caution, as if she measured every interaction before allowing it to settle. She greeted Caleb politely, her voice calm, and poured his coffee without asking unnecessary questions. Caleb ordered the cheapest item on the menu. He ate slowly when it arrived, methodically, as if time belonged to him rather than the other way around. Rex accepted a small portion slid carefully beneath the table, chewing without sound. Nothing about them demanded attention, yet something in their stillness shifted the atmosphere just enough to be felt, even if no one could have said why. Outside, a door slammed. Footsteps approached. The murmur inside the diner thinned, the way sound does when people sense a change before they see it. The bell rang again as the door opened, sharper this time, and Deputy Sheriff Alan Crow stepped inside. Crow filled the doorway easily. He was broad through the chest and waist, his uniform stretched tight in places it shouldn't have been. His face was ruddy, his eyes small and restless, his hair slicked back in an attempt at order that didn't quite work. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his badge catching the light as he crossed the room. The sidearm at his hip rested where his hand could drift toward it without effort, a reminder he enjoyed providing. No one greeted him. No one needed to. The effect of his presence was immediate and familiar. Shoulders tightened, eyes dropped. Emily's hands paused for a fraction of a second on the coffee pot before she forced them to move again. Crow took a seat at the counter, leaning back slightly, occupying more space than necessary. He ordered without courtesy, his voice loud enough to be heard, and laughed once to himself, as if sharing a joke only he understood. Caleb observed without turning his head. He saw the way people adjusted around Crow, the way the room contracted subtly, making itself smaller. He noted the absence of resistance, the practiced quiet that followed every word Crow spoke. It was not the silence of respect, it was the silence of endurance. Red Willow functioned like this because it had learned to. The town had adapted around a center of gravity that pulled everything inward. People survived by staying out of its path. As Caleb finished his meal, the air inside the diner felt heavier, layered with something unspoken. He had no context yet, no history with these people or this place. Only the sense that control here did not belong to the law so much as to the man wearing it. When Caleb stood to pay, his movements remained calm, deliberate. He placed cash on the counter, more than required, folding the bills neatly. Emily glanced up, surprise flickering briefly before she masked it with a polite nod. Caleb said nothing beyond a quiet, "Thank you." Rex rose smoothly from beneath the table and moved to his side, matching his pace as they turned toward the door. As they approached the exit, the diner held its breath without realizing it. The bell above the door waited to ring again, thin and fragile, as if uncertain whether it should announce what was about to follow. Outside, the wind continued to move dust across the empty road, indifferent to the small tensions building inside a place most of the world would never notice. Caleb reached for the door, unaware that Red Willow was about to test the limits it had spent years teaching itself not to cross. Deputy Sheriff Alan Crow did not look at the people in the diner as individuals. He looked at them the way a man looks at fixtures he expects to remain where they are. The counter, the stools, the cracked vinyl booths, the people sitting in them, all part of the same environment he believed he controlled. He drank his coffee loudly, slurping without apology, letting the sound carry. It was a small act, but it served its purpose. It reminded everyone that he was present, and that presence came with consequences. Emily Carter moved along the counter with measured steps. She had learned to keep her shoulders relaxed and her expression neutral, to never appear hurried and never appear defiant. At 32, she had mastered a version of calm that did not come from peace, but from repetition. Her life had narrowed since she returned to Red Willow after her divorce, narrowed to her job, her small rented house, and her 8-year-old son who waited for her to come home every night. She worked long shifts because long shifts paid bills, and because being visible in public spaces during the day felt safer than being alone with her thoughts. Crow watched her in the lazy way he watched everything, his eyes following her movement, not with interest, but with ownership. He had been doing this for years, long enough that the town no longer reacted with shock. Discomfort had become routine, and routine had become background noise. Emily felt his attention on her back and kept moving, telling herself that if she stayed careful, stayed quiet, this would pass the way it usually did. It didn't. As she reached across the counter to refill his cup, her elbow brushed the edge of the coffee pot. It was a minor mistake, barely noticeable under normal circumstances. A small splash arced outward, dark liquid striking the counter, and a few drops landing on Crow's sleeve. Time hesitated, stretching thin. Emily's breath caught as she realized what had happened. She opened her mouth to apologize, already preparing the words. The slap came before the apology. It was loud, sharp, the sound of skin meeting skin echoing off the diner's walls. Emily staggered half a step, her head snapping to the side as pain bloomed across her cheek. The coffee pot clattered against the counter, but did not fall. For a moment, everything stopped. Conversations died mid-word. The hum of the heater seemed suddenly too loud. Emily stood frozen, one hand lifting instinctively, before hovering uselessly in the air, unsure whether acknowledging the pain would make it worse. Crow rose from his stool slowly, deliberately, his face set in a look of irritation rather than remorse. He did not look around to see who had witnessed it. He knew. He enjoyed knowing. "Watch what you're doing," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "You people get careless when you think nobody's paying attention." The words hung in the air, heavy and undefined. No one spoke. No one moved. Emily swallowed and forced herself upright, her hand lowering back to her side. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She murmured an apology that did not belong to her, because experience had taught her that apologies sometimes bought survival. Caleb Turner saw everything. He did not stand. He did not speak. He did not turn his head sharply or clench his fists. He simply watched, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. Stillness was not unfamiliar to him. He had learned long ago that reacting too quickly often served the wrong purpose. Under the table, Rex's body tightened, muscles coiling, a low vibration of readiness running through him. Caleb pressed his foot lightly against the dog's shoulder, a silent command. Rex remained still, discipline holding him in place. Crow's eyes scanned the diner then, feeding on the silence. He saw the lowered gazes, the rigid postures, the careful stillness. It satisfied him. Then his attention landed on Caleb, on the calm posture, on the lack of visible reaction, on the dog at his feet. Crow mistook restraint for fear, composure for submission. A crooked smile tugged at his mouth. He had found a new target. Caleb rose after a moment, movements unhurried. He walked to the counter and placed his cash down, counting it carefully. He added more than necessary, folding the bills neatly. "That covers mine," he said quietly. He did not look at Crow. He did not acknowledge the slap. He slid the money forward and turned slightly away. As he did, he reached into his pocket and removed a small folded piece of paper. He placed it discreetly beneath the edge of Emily's plate, not drawing attention, not explaining. A phone number. No name. No context. Emily noticed it only because she was watching everything now, her senses sharpened by shock. Her eyes flicked to Caleb, then back to the paper. Something unfamiliar stirred behind her fear. Crow's smile faded. Caleb's refusal to engage did not read as weakness anymore. It read as dismissal. That Crow could not tolerate. He moved quickly, stepping into Caleb's path as he turned toward the door. One boot angled outward, blocking the exit without appearing overt. His hand drifted toward his holster, resting there casually. "Leaving already?" Crow said, his tone light, mocking. "Funny. You don't look like most drifters." Caleb stopped. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He met Crow's gaze calmly, his voice even. "Yes." The single word landed harder than a challenge. Crow stepped closer, invading space deliberately. The diner shrank around them. Rex rose smoothly, stopping when Caleb stopped, eyes fixed on Crow's midsection, reading balance and intent. "Big dog," Crow said, his lips curling. "Yours?" "Yes." Silence stretched. Crow's jaw tightened. He didn't like being answered without deference. He didn't like not being feared. His hand came up suddenly, striking Caleb across the face with open force. The sound cracked through the diner. Caleb staggered half a step, more from surprise than pain. Blood touched his tongue. Rex surged forward, a low growl breaking free. "Stay," Caleb said, his voice sharp and controlled. Rex froze mid-motion, muscles quivering, eyes locked on Crow. Obedience wrestled instinct into place. Crow laughed once, short and ugly. He raised his hand again, enjoying the moment, enjoying the power. Caleb shifted sideways, just as the second blow came, and Crow's momentum carried him off balance. His boot caught a chair leg. He went down hard, crashing into a table. Plates shattered. Coffee spilled. The room gasped as one. Crow scrambled, fury replacing confidence. His hand flew to his gun. "On the ground!" he shouted. "You're resisting!" Caleb did not argue. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to the floor, lying flat, hands moving behind his back. "Stay," he said again, meant only for Rex. Crow forced the cuffs on with unnecessary force, his knee pressing into Caleb's back. The clicks echoed. He hauled Caleb to his feet and dragged him toward the door. No one intervened. No one spoke. Fear still ruled the room, but something else had entered with it now. As the door slammed behind them, Red Willow felt it too. Not anger. Not justice yet. Just the unmistakable sense that a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. The diner did not recover its rhythm after the door slammed shut. Sound returned in fragments rather than flow. The heater ticking, a chair leg scraping as someone shifted, the faint hiss of spilled coffee cooling on linoleum. No one spoke. No one needed to. What had just happened was too clear to be softened by words. Emily Carter stood behind the counter with her hands braced against the edge, fingers spread as if anchoring herself to something solid. Her cheek burned where Crow's hand had struck her, the heat sharp and persistent. She did not touch it. Touching it would make it real in a way she had learned to avoid. Her eyes followed the empty space near the door where Caleb had been taken, then dropped to the plate in front of her. The folded paper rested there, half hidden, its presence suddenly loud. She did not pick it up yet. Fear still pressed down on her chest, but beneath it, something else had begun to stir, fragile and dangerous. Outside, cold air rushed in and swallowed the sound of the diner. Crow shoved Caleb toward the cruiser, his grip rough, his breathing uneven. The gravel lot offered no witnesses willing to intervene. A second deputy waited near the vehicle, older and heavier, his posture resigned. He avoided looking at Caleb as he reached for Rex's collar, looping a length of rope around a metal post near the entrance. The dog stood rigid, muscles tight beneath his coat, amber eyes tracking Caleb with unwavering focus. He did not bark. He did not struggle. Loyalty did not need noise. Caleb was placed in the back seat. The door closed with a final hollow sound. The cruiser pulled away, tires spitting dust as it merged back onto the highway. Red Willow watched it go without chasing after it. The town had learned long ago that chasing authority only made it run you over. Inside the diner, George Nolan finally moved. The owner stepped out from behind the register, his boots heavy against the floor. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered despite the years, his hands thick and scarred from a lifetime of labor before the diner had become his refuge. He bent slowly to gather the broken plates, his breath shallow, the familiar tightness in his chest reminding him of years spent underground and the cost of breathing bad air too long. He did not look at Emily as he worked. He did not need to. He knew what she was feeling. He had seen it before in different forms, on different faces. At the far end of the counter, Lucas Hale sat stiffly on his stool. He was 24, fresh out of the academy, his uniform still crisp, his boots polished with a care that bordered on anxiety. His hands rested flat on his thighs, fingers curled slightly as if holding himself in place. Lucas had grown up believing that rules mattered because they created boundaries people could trust. Watching Crow had already strained that belief. Seeing him strike a woman and then fabricate an arrest had nearly broken it. His stomach churned as he replayed the scene in his head, each detail sharpening rather than fading. When the diner finally emptied, Emily moved slowly, methodically, as if routine might keep her steady. She wiped the counter where the coffee had spilled, her movements precise. Only when she was alone did she reach for the folded paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A phone number, written in careful block letters. Nothing else. She stared at it for a long moment, weighing its meaning against the risks she knew too well. Hope was not something Red Willow encouraged. It tended to get punished. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant and cold metal. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flattening time into something measured by footsteps in the hallway and the occasional clank of a door. Caleb sat on the narrow bench with his back straight, his breathing slow and even. The cuffs had left red marks on his wrists, but he paid them little attention. He had learned to endure worse. What mattered now was clarity. He did not replay the diner in his head. He did not feed anger or regret. He treated the moment as finished, a fact already sealed. 48 hours could stretch or compress depending on how a man met them. Caleb met them with discipline, anchoring his mind in small, controllable things. Counted breaths, measured thoughts, silence used correctly. Lucas did not sleep that night. He went home and sat on the edge of his bed in uniform, staring at the wall until the room felt too small for his thoughts. By dawn, his decision had settled into place, heavy but immovable. He returned to the station early, moving quietly through the halls. The security office was empty. The monitors glowed softly, recording without judgment. Lucas sat down, his hands shaking just enough to betray him if anyone had been watching. He knew Crow's habits. He knew which cameras were usually down and which files tended to disappear after nights like this. When he accessed the system, his jaw tightened. The footage was still there, overlooked in the rush of rage and authority. He copied it carefully, labeling dates and times, saving it onto a small drive he had brought from home. Evidence only mattered if it survived the first attempt to erase it. When he finished, he logged out and wiped the access trail as best he could, then sat still for a long moment, hands flat on the desk. There was no going back now. Across town, George unlocked the diner before sunrise. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of disinfectant. He worked alone, wiping down surfaces that had seen too much. His movements were slower than they used to be, but his eyes were clear. Years ago, he had learned to keep copies when he was told to erase things. Not out of bravery, but out of refusal. Refusal to let the town forget itself completely. Emily arrived while it was still dark, her cheek faintly bruised, her hair pulled back tighter than usual. She moved stiffly, her usual softness replaced by something brittle. Seeing Caleb taken had done what years of quiet endurance had not. It had shown her that silence protected the wrong people. George closed the door behind them and led her to the small office at the back. He opened a dented metal cabinet and removed a stack of envelopes and drives, each marked with dates and brief notes. "I kept copies," he said simply. Emily stared at the evidence, her breath catching. Proof that she had not imagined her fear. Proof that the report she filed years ago had once been real. She nodded once, understanding settling in where terror had lived. When Caleb was released, it came without apology. No charges. A suggestion to leave town. He accepted it without comment. Outside, Rex surged forward at the sight of him, checking himself at the end of the chain. Caleb knelt, resting a hand against the dog's neck. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm here." He made his calls from a payphone at the edge of town. Short, precise, facts, locations, the promise of material evidence, no accusations, no heat. Systems responded best when approached without drama. When he finished, he retrieved Rex and drove away from the station, not looking back. Red Willow did not change immediately. It absorbed what had happened the way it absorbed everything else, quietly, heavily. But beneath the surface, pressure was shifting. Fear had not vanished. It had been joined by something new. And once introduced, it would not leave easily. The town did not announce what it was becoming. It did not gather in the street or whisper openly. Red Willow shifted the way old structures do when pressure redistributes beneath them, quietly, with small sounds that only those paying attention could hear. Doors closed more carefully. Conversations paused at different moments. People began to look at one another a second longer than before, as if measuring whether silence was still the safest option. Caleb Turner did not remain to watch it happen. He had learned that standing in the middle of a process could slow it down. Once the facts were delivered, his role was finished. He drove west until the town disappeared behind a bend in the highway, then stopped briefly at a pull-off where the land opened into long, empty distance. Rex sat upright beside him, eyes forward, posture composed. Caleb rested his hands on the steering wheel, letting the engine idle while he made one final call. It was short and deliberate. He confirmed receipt, repeated dates and locations, and ended the call without commentary. Then he drove on, leaving Red Willow to what had already begun. Back in town, Lucas Hale moved through his days with careful precision. He did not speak of what he had done. He did not hint or posture. He kept his uniform pressed and his answers brief, performing routine the way it was expected of him. But something fundamental had changed. Fear still existed, but it no longer controlled his decisions. When Crow passed him in the hallway, Lucas met his eyes and did not look away. Crow noticed. He always noticed. He dismissed it with a sneer, but irritation crept into his movements, small and persistent. Emily Carter returned to work with her cheek still faintly yellowed beneath makeup she applied sparingly. She moved through the diner with a new stiffness, not weakness, but resolve held too tightly. Customers noticed the difference without understanding it. She did not apologize as quickly. She did not shrink as much. When Crow failed to appear for 2 days in a row, the absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. Rumors drifted without anchors. No one confirmed anything. The town waited. George Nolan handed over the last of what he had kept on a gray morning that smelled like cold metal and rain that never quite arrived. He met the agents in his office, his hand steady as he placed envelopes and drives onto the desk. Each item carried a piece of history Red Willow had tried to bury. He felt lighter when it was done, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. For years, he had told himself he was only surviving. Now he understood he had been preparing. The federal vehicles arrived without sirens. 2 dark sedans rolled into town and parked near the sheriff's office, their presence unremarkable to anyone passing through, unmistakable to those who lived there. The agents moved with quiet efficiency, credentials presented without flourish. Authority did not raise its voice. It asked questions and waited for answers. Crow tried to laugh it off at first. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and questioned jurisdiction. When that failed, he raised his voice, appealing to procedure and local control. When that failed, too, something in him collapsed inward. The badge that had carried him for years no longer shielded him. The cuffs clicked closed without ceremony. He looked smaller as they let him out, his anger draining into something close to disbelief. There were no cheers. There were no shouts. Only the scrape of boots on concrete and the quiet closing of a cruiser door. Lucas gave his statement in a room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and paper. His voice was steady, surprising even himself. He described what he had seen, what he had copied, what he had preserved when erasure had been expected. He did not dramatize. He did not accuse. He recited facts the way he had been trained to, realizing as he spoke that this was what training had been meant for all along. When he finished, he sat back, breathing slowly, the weight in his chest shifting shape. Fear did not vanish. It transformed. Emily met with a witness advocate later that afternoon. The woman spoke calmly, explaining protections and timelines, outlining steps that made the future feel less like a void. Emily listened, nodding, her posture straighter than it had been in years. The slap had faded. The memory had not. It no longer lived as pain. It lived as proof. When she signed the paperwork placed in front of her, her hand did not tremble. The diner opened as usual that evening. The bell chimed softly. Coffee brewed. Plates clinked. But something in the air had changed. People spoke more quietly, not from fear, but from awareness. They sat a little taller. The room felt larger, as if the ceiling had been raised without anyone touching it. George worked the counter with familiar movements, his shoulders less tense now that he was no longer guarding secrets alone. Snow began to fall just before dusk. Thin at first, patient, drifting down in narrow lines that softened the edges of the town. By the time Caleb Turner returned, the ground held a light dusting that muted sound and slowed movement. He parked across the street from the diner, engine idling. Rex sat in the passenger seat, wearing his black, tactical harness, unmarked and functional. He watched the door without tension, reading Caleb's posture and understanding that the work here was nearly finished. Caleb stepped out into the cold, snow settling on his shoulders. He did not cross the street. He did not enter the diner. He stood where he was, letting the quiet do what it needed to do. Across the way, Emily stepped into the doorway. She did not wave. She did not speak. She placed a hand against her chest and inclined her head once. Caleb returned the gesture with a simple nod. It was enough. No words were required. The truck pulled away slowly, tires whispering against the wet pavement. Red Willow did not watch him go. It did not need to. The town had not changed overnight. It would not be easy. But silence had cracked, and once cracked, it did not seal itself easily again. Justice did not arrive in Red Willow with noise. There were no flashing lights tearing through the night, no crowds gathering to watch history be made. It came the way most lasting things did in places like this, quietly, deliberately, without asking permission to be noticed. The federal investigation unfolded over days rather than hours. Agents moved in and out of the sheriff's office with calm efficiency, requesting files, interviewing staff, asking questions that had been avoided for years. Each answer led to another document, another date, another name. The pattern became impossible to ignore. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents took shape as something far more deliberate and sustained. Power had been used not to protect, but to dominate, and it had relied on silence to survive. Alan Crow sat alone in a holding room that felt smaller than it should have. Without his badge, without his gun, without the weight of fear to prop him up, he looked like what he was, a man who had confused authority with entitlement for far too long. He argued less now. The confidence that once filled rooms had drained out of him, leaving irritation and disbelief in its place. He had built his life on the assumption that no one would ever challenge him openly. That assumption had failed, not because of force, but because restraint had outlasted intimidation. Lucas Hale returned to work wearing the same uniform, but it no longer felt like a costume. The badge on his chest carried weight now, not because it gave him power, but because he had chosen to be accountable to it. When he walked through town, people met his eyes differently. Some nodded, some said nothing at all. That was fine. He understood now that doing the right thing rarely came with applause. What mattered was that he could live with himself at the end of the day. Emily Carter continued working the diner, though her hours shifted and her posture changed. She stood straighter, not out of defiance, but out of relief. The advocate checked in regularly, explaining next steps, ensuring protections were in place. Emily listened, asked questions, learned the language of process that had once felt deliberately inaccessible. Fear had not disappeared from her life, but it no longer dictated her choices. She had spoken, and speaking had reshaped the ground beneath her feet. George Nolan watched it all from behind the counter he had stood at for decades. His hands still bore the marks of hard labor. His breathing still carried the weight of years underground. But something in his expression had eased. The cabinet in his office stood empty now, its contents finally delivered where they belonged. He no longer felt like a custodian of buried truths. He had passed that responsibility on, and the release was visible in the way he moved, lighter despite the years. The diner filled and emptied as it always had. Coffee was poured. Plates were served. The bell chimed. But the silence that once pressed down on the room had shifted. It no longer felt like fear holding its breath. It felt like a tension. People listened differently now. They spoke with care rather than caution. The town had not become brave overnight. It had become awake. Snow continued to fall, steady and patient, covering Red Willow in a thin white layer that softened edges and slowed time. The road out of town stretched pale and quiet beneath it. Caleb Turner drove west with Rex beside him, the hum of the engine steady, familiar. The desert opened ahead, vast and indifferent, offering no judgment and no reward. That suited him. He did not think of himself as a hero. He had not stayed to be thanked, had not waited for outcomes to be confirmed in person. His role had never been to fix the town. It had been to stand still long enough for others to find their footing. Once that happened, staying would only have drawn attention where none was needed. Rex rested with his chin near the window, ears lifting occasionally at the sound of wind. The dog was calm, composed, content in motion. Discipline had not dulled his instincts. It had refined them. Loyalty did not require recognition. It required consistency. As the truck disappeared into the distance, Red Willow remained where it was, small and unremarkable on any map. It would not be written about in headlines. No monuments would be raised. But something essential had shifted. Silence had been challenged and found lacking. Truth had been spoken without shouting, and that had been enough. Sometimes justice does not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes like snow, quiet, patient, covering what was sharp and exposing what was hidden by contrast alone. It does not erase what came before. It changes what comes after. In Red Willow, people would remember the moment not as a spectacle, but as a turning. The day when fear lost its certainty. The day when restraint proved stronger than violence. The day when one person refused to look away, and others discovered they no longer had to either. The road stretched on, the snow fell thicker, and somewhere behind, a town learned how to breathe again. This wasn't about violence, it was about truth. Like the video, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from.